Today, I am delighted to be joined by paranormal researcher Hayley Stevens. Hayley has had a lifelong interest in ghosts and monsters and approaches these subjects in a rational and balanced way. Her award-winning blog, The Marvellous Hayley Is A Ghost, is full of thought-provoking articles and investigations and is a valuable and informative resource for anyone with an interest in fortean themes. Hayley, I'm delighted to welcome you to Mysteries and Monsters. How are we?
Hello, it's wonderful to be here. Thank you for inviting me. Yeah, I'm well, thank you. Yourself?
Yes, we're not bad, thank you, for an overcast, cloudy Yorkshire Tuesday, so we're doing okay, thank you. So,
Good.
Hayley, as I touched on in your introduction, you're someone I've got a great deal of respect, and I've followed your career over the last couple since your work came to my attention. And I've always found your way of approaching paranormal and fortean refreshingly balanced. So I know you are often labelled as a skeptic, whereas I personally think of you as someone who is simply a balanced and rational investigator, personally. So
Right.
what is your reason for being interested in this field? What got you so excited about this very strange and weird subject?
Well, from a very young age, I grew up in a house here in Wiltshire. I've lived in Wiltshire my entire life, and the house that I grew up in until I was 18 was quite spooky. Some very strange things would happen in the house that I experienced, my mum experienced, my younger brother, and I was pretty much convinced that it was a haunted house. And so I grew up with a belief in the paranormal, specifically in ghosts, but yeah, anything I would believe that it was true. And I was quite scared by it. Then as I became a teenager, in the early 2000s, obviously there was a show called Most Haunted, which hit our screens around the time that I was probably about 15 or 16 at that time, and it caught my attention. I was kind of questioning things a lot more rather than just being scared of them, and so I would watch the show. It was a big thing. Like, my mum and I would both watch it together. And then came along the whole scandal with Derek Acorah, where it was alleged that he was faking his possessions, or at least using pre-supplied information to do the medium thing on the show.
Yes.
And at that time, I think it was about 2005, and we decided, do you know what? This is silly that we're relying on other people for information. We should just go and do this for ourselves. And so my mum and I was about 18 at the time, my mum and I formed a ghost investigation group, and a number of people were interested in joining. So we would then, for the next few years, go around Wiltshire visiting places who believed they had ghosts and sort of investigating the hauntings. At the same time, I was also working in a bakery shop in a nearby town in a shopping centre, and some very strange stuff was happening there that I still, even to this day, I have no real explanation for. Still kind of puzzles me a little bit. So at the beginning of my time as a ghost investigator, I very much believed in the paranormal and the supernatural, and but over the years that sort of changed. So rather than being someone who believed in ghosts and was looking for evidence of survival of the spirit, I sort of changed my outlook, and I changed my approach to one where I try to look for rational causes and explain away phenomena, but without debunking or kind of dismissing a priori and out of hand. And that was kind of where I am today, really.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting, and I can't move on without responding to your point in regards to Most Haunted, because I remember that I was obsessed with it when it first started, probably the same as yourself and your mum.
Yes,
And
absolutely.
every week I was like, oh, where are they going now? And I'd know of these locations, obviously, because of having a lifelong interest in the paranormal, and they'd be going to the cage and searching for the ghost. I mean, obviously, one of the most infamous episodes is when they go searching for Dick Turpin's ghost, and I'm
Yes.
sure most people have seen that clip. And if you haven't, I will put it in this week's show notes if anybody can enjoy that for themselves. And numerous incidents and possessions and things. But there was one particular show where I kind of went through that Damascus revelation where they were doing something and they were saying, oh, there's absolutely nobody down here, nobody can be doing this, nobody can be doing that. And then as the camera was panning around, there was somebody at the end of this tunnel. And I thought, well, that's clearly not a ghost because they got a torch. And
a ghost could have a torch.
Well, it could do, but then it moved backwards and I thought, aha. And at that point, I basically went on a 360 and I just thought,
Yes.
And it's one of those that obviously it continued past that point, but my interest at that point had waned sufficiently that whilst I also, strangely enough, grew up in a haunted house, I've often been labelled as quite a sceptical person, despite the fact that I am probably of a similar train of thought of yourself, Hayley, that I'm not the type of person that will dismiss things out of hand. However, I think the modern situation we have with, especially in paranormal television, is the majority of it is simply running about screaming, which,
yes,
as far as I'm concerned, isn't the best basis for any sort of investigation at all.
No, not at all. Yes, exactly. It's quite sensationalism, isn't it?
Yes, and I, I'm sure anybody will point out, the majority of these shows these days at the beginning have this program is for entertainment purposes only. But that's usually down to legal reasons rather than the fact that it's not believable, which I think is one of those misnomers that people kind of assume that, oh, well, it's definitely entertainment. But I've yet to see any kind of program of that ilk that doesn't, unfortunately, fall into these cliches of, oh, look, there's some dust. It's clearly the spirits of the dead come to guide us through this house.
Right, yeah, exactly.
I mean, as someone that started off ghost hunting, Hayley, is it difficult to avoid that kind of preconceived notions when you go to locations? Because I think a lot of people go into certain places expecting to see something or expecting to be frightened, so they are already emotionally heightened in whichever way, whether it's excitement or fear or panic. And that perhaps makes people more susceptible to standard noises, and old houses creak, we know that. So did you find it difficult to navigate these well-established sticking points for the paranormal investigator?
I think really it's about why you're doing the investigation in the first place. So to begin with, I would go to allegedly haunted places because I wanted to find evidence of ghost activity. And so my expectations were there that I was going to go and potentially find ghost activity. And you're right, that then influenced the outcome of what I was doing because I was primed that the place was haunted. And so every knocking noise, every slight movement of the building would potentially be labelled as ghost activity. Whereas now what I tend to do when somebody reports having a ghost or someone gets in touch to say something weird's going on here, we'd love your opinion, I go in with the mindset that I want to find out what's going on. And that encompasses all potential explanations. I'm willing to accept that there might be something a bit weird going on, something unexplainable. But I'm also willing to accept that it's not that, and that it could be, I don't know, environmental, it could be atmospheric, it could be something to do with the building, it could be a hoax, it could be, it could be all sorts of things that are causing people to have a strange experience or to have an experience that they are interpreting as being spooky when actually the next person might not perceive it that way. And so I think my goal is to be as objective as possible when I conduct an investigation, but I'm doing that as a human being, and human beings are by their very nature subjective. We make subjective decisions and reach conclusions based on our biases and so on. So it's, by the very nature of trying to be objective, it's sort of almost going against human nature, which is pretty much impossible. So even though I'm someone who goes in with a rational outlook, or at least tries to. I may not always be rational, but I try to be. I'm still working against those biases, because even though we know about cognitive biases and we know about the pareidolia effect and things like that, we still fall victim to them, so we still experience them. And actually, there was a great example of this that I experienced where I was at a skeptic conference. So this conference being organised by the UK skeptic movement.
Yeah.
And it was being held in a hotel in Manchester that was said to be haunted. And I was in the bar one afternoon, sort of between sessions at the conference, and with a group of people that I know from the kind of skeptic movement. And the conversation got around to the fact that the place is haunted, and obviously they know that I blog about ghosts, I investigate hauntings, and so they were like, oh, teach us how to talk to the ghost, Hayley. And I was like, oh yeah, okay. So I taught them how to do glass divination, and so I got like an empty glass and I turned it upside down, and I was like, right, so what you need to do is you need to envision, like an energy flowing around this group at this table, and it's going through us all down our arms into the glass, and then we're going to ask the spirit to use that energy to move the glass, to use our collective energy to move the glass to communicate with us. And they're all like rolling their eyes, because they know that it's they know that it's ideomotor responses, so unconscious muscular movement, that probably makes these things work. They know that because we've all heard the talks by psychologists and so on at these skeptic events, the very events that we're attending. And so we're all sat there with our fingers on the glass, and it starts to move around the table, and the faces of the people around the table are of pure surprise, because none of them were expecting it, and they were convinced that I was moving the glass. So I took my hand off. I'm not moving it, and it carried on moving. And then like one by one, people would put their finger back on, and then somebody else would take their finger off, and it was still moving. So although these skeptics at this event knew about ideomotor responses and how planchettes on Ouija boards move and dowsing rods move, they knew that information, but they still experienced it for themselves, because although we can know about how these things affect us, we still experience them, because we are controlled very largely by our brain, and that's what experiences these sorts of cognitive shortcuts.
Yeah, I mean, I often find that very interesting when people come up against that kind of situation, because I've used Ouija boards enough to know exactly how they work, and I've had a couple of very odd experiences, but the vast majority of the time it's absolute nonsense. And more often than not, I suspect someone, either voluntary or involuntary, is guiding it on a certain path, and there are all kinds of things at play. But primarily, it's interesting to see people, especially people as you refer to there, who come with a very sceptical slant and are yet still surprised. I think primarily, the biggest surprise for those people would have been, well, I know this isn't supposed to work, and yet here it is.
And that's the thing, because it does work, because of what's causing it, and it's unconscious. So even though they were aware of it, they still contributed to it because of the kind of expectation in the group. It was very, very interesting to kind of witness that.
Very much so. Which particular hotel was that, by the way? I've been in a couple in Manchester.
I can't remember off the top of my head. The haunted one.
Unfortunately, these days, I would suspect there are. I mean, this is the other aspect to this kind of thing as well, Hayley, is a lot of these places are private enterprises or businesses, and loath for me to be sceptical in regards to the fact that certain businesses will advertise themselves as haunted, or they have a specific room where no one gets a good night's sleep because of some poor woman that killed herself, lovelorn, heartbroken woman from the 19th century who threw herself out the window, or some other story that seems to perpetuate around the United Kingdom especially. And therefore it's very difficult to often view these through the prism of a balanced kind of investigation, because it helps these, not that, like I say, I'm not casting aspersions on some of these establishments, but there are certainly some that play up to this kind of reputation, because it brings people there who spend money, in whether they stay the night or they stay in the bar or they have a meal in these particular locations, Hayley. It's kind of a self-perpetuating myth. You tell everybody how bad it is, people will come, nothing happened, so they didn't think, oh, well, we need to come back again.
Exactly, and I think it's always been like that. I think people who are involved in paranormal research today can be a little bit guilty of thinking that it's a modern thing, that businesses advertise themselves as the most haunted pub or the most haunted hotel. And actually, I don't think it is that modern. I think that's always been a thing in society. People have always been curious about, the afterlife and the concept of ghosts and spirits and so on, and businesses have always profited off that in one way or another. And I think and as have criminals, you kind of you look back through history and there are some brilliant cases where criminals use ghostly activity to cover up their wrongdoings, and so I think that's always been the case. And although I'm sure paranormal television shows have pushed it a bit more and made people realise that their ghostly heritage is actually quite a valuable thing for them. Although I am more skeptically inclined, I don't necessarily think it's a terrible thing as long as the businesses are not outright faking activity or hoodwinking people. People will always use their haunted heritage to their advantage. And especially a lot of places now are owned by charitable organisations. And so, for example, I remember going to Winchester Mansion a number of years ago, and the restoration work that they're doing there is fantastic, and they need, obviously, to raise money every year to keep the place open and to keep it upright. Yes. And so they make some money from doing ghost tours there and allowing people in to do ghost hunts. And I think as long as nobody is being harmed and nobody's being misled or ripped off by people being fraudulent, then I'm inclined to think that it's not necessarily a terrible thing.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think often it's a good way of perhaps bringing people into locations, and as you say, some of these are run by charitable organisations, and we should be looking at different ways to protect and bring revenue to these places, because I think sometimes they struggle to kind of encourage people to visit them under normal guises.
Yes.
So if anything, paranormal tourism can be a real benefit to certain locations in that regard. So I fully and wholeheartedly agree with your point there, because there was a very similar situation here in where I live in Sheffield, where there used to be a pub. It's no longer there, and sadly it is now a Starbucks, and it's just off the M1 near Meadowhall. And it used to advertise itself as the most haunted pub in Sheffield. It had a big banner outside it with ghosts on it and everything. Clearly it wasn't that spooky, because obviously it went bust. But, however, the pub across the road had a banner in response, which basically said, "The only spirits you'll find in here are behind the bar."
Right.
So they were basically playing off each other, whether it was good-natured or not. I never really delve into it that much, but that always made me chuckle, and ironically both have gone under. So clearly, whichever way it was, it didn't happen. But it is a very interesting thing, because a few years ago, in my previous youth, I was a landlord. I ran public houses. So pubs are notoriously supposed homes for many a spirit, especially here in the United Kingdom. I think most major cities and towns, Hayley, will have a famous pub or something that has a long-standing tradition of being haunted or a regular resident spirit. I was once interviewed for a book about ghosts in Sheffield, and they came in and they said, "All right, we're here to talk about this pub and just asking you if you've got any ghosts." I said, "Nah, there's nothing here, never has been. I've worked here 9 years, nothing." So imagine my surprise 18 months later, where there was a nice paragraph going on about ghostly footsteps in the pub, and it terrified the staff. And I was like, well, I never said that, and nobody before we took the pub over had ever had any kind of mention of ghosts or spirits. So therefore I came to two conclusions. Either somebody else was interviewed and they made it up, or the person writing the book just stuck it in there, which is disappointing in both aspects.
Yeah, definitely. Or they just kept asking people until somebody said, yeah. I worked there 50 years ago, and there was once some footsteps.
Yeah, I mean, if you work, I mean, it's one of those things, Hayley, that always is a bone of contention for myself, as I say, as a landlord. Whenever I see footage of exploding glasses in a bar,
Yes.
I just think, well, you've clearly only just started working in the bar if that frightens you, because
Yeah.
the one thing about working in a bar is glasses blow up all the time.
Yes.
Primarily because you're sticking them in hyper hot washing machines and you can't see tiny cracks, and eventually it will certainly hit a particular spot or a weak point, and the right environment, the right temperature, you may have just left it there, it'll pop. And it is a frightening thing when it happens the first time. You're like, oh my God, what's going on? But eventually it happens so often that you eventually think, yeah, I'm not buying any more of these glasses. They're rubbish. I think is the one, rather than, because what you know what I mean. It is one of those things that whenever I see that, I just completely dismiss it, because I've worked in the industry so long. That to me is not unusual.
And it's like the footage that you see of like pint glasses slowly moving down a bar. It's not actually that strange when you think about the water that's on them and the surfaces. And I've seen it happen quite often. I get stuff out of a dishwasher at work in the kitchen in the office, and you put cups up on the top, and then they just very slowly start sliding along because of the sort of the water's bubbling at the bottom of them where you've caught the air. And to an outsider who's never seen that before, it would look very spooky. But obviously having the knowledge as someone who has seen it before, or people who work in pubs knowing about the glasses exploding, it's not that weird at all. It's all about perspective, isn't it, really?
Absolutely. And I think that's one of those experiences, Hayley, because a lot of strange things can be spotted. I mean, there are occasionally things I've seen a couple of pieces of footage of. I always find glasses that seem to jump off tables far more interesting than a million exploding glasses. But then again, you're not too sure, is it what it seems? It is a difficult situation to kind of balance, and I think it is a little frustrating at times when these things, because occasionally, we can both think of countless examples that have been shown on television as paranormal footage, and especially in this day and age on YouTube, there is a multitude of alleged footage which is sometimes hilariously bad, but it's amazing how certain things can get picked up and end up on television, and you're just like, well, you can see the string, for God's sake.
I was once told by television producers, because I don't particularly want to be on television, but I do get contacted and then invited to go and have meetings. I'm like, yeah, why not? Why not? And I remember going into London one time to go and meet these TV producers. I think it was ITV, but I'm not 100% sure. And I was in these swanky offices, and I was there for at least a couple of hours talking to these people who were developing this show. And then at the end of the meeting, as I was sort of being shown out of the building, the woman who had invited me to the meeting said, well, skepticism just doesn't make good television, does it? And I was like, yeah, but neither does this nonsense that you're showing. That's not good television either, to be honest. I don't know who you think you're fooling, but that's not good TV either, I'm afraid.
Yeah, it is interesting. I think it applies to a lot of things because, like I say, I love the paranormal, Hayley, and I'm very interested in it. And I've heard some compelling accounts, and I've like I say, I've had some very strange things in my younger life occur. But it is a little bit annoying because I remember once before I set the show up, I was, like I say, most people who know me in my friend circle will say I'm the believer guy. I'm the person who knows about ghosts and goblins and bogarts and UFOs and alien abduction. If you need to speak to somebody, Paul's the man to talk to about it because he knows all kinds of weird stuff. So, and I was once told when I started this, after a few shows, I got an email saying that I was being too realistic and I needed to increase the woo factor. And it's one of those things. I think a prime example of something like that really annoys me is when people talk about the Winchester mansion, for a prime example, where people claim that it's full of ghosts and the house has these places that lead nowhere, and Mrs. Winchester was mad as a box of frogs, which has all come from a book written in the 1960s, I think, which basically created this legend about the Winchester house, and it was all the spirits of the dead people killed by the Winchester rifles that obviously were coming back to take their spiritual revenge, Hayley.
Yes.
But I know the vast majority of that is absolute nonsense. None of it's true. I mean, Mrs. Winchester actually built a gun range in the house. So,
Yes.
for someone who was allegedly terrified of guns and spirits, that's not usually the kind of reaction you would say. And if you tell people that, they go, "Did she?" Because they don't know. They've no idea.
Exactly.
And it's like
people they kind of view Sarah Winchester through the lens of today, and so when they look back, they presume that the guilt about the rifles and everything would be true based on their perspective today. But I know that there was a biographer. I can't remember the biographer's name, but I remember her writing that the kind of ghost stories were cooked up by the journalists back then, but that the damage sort of in the building where there are doors that lead nowhere and staircases and so on, that was caused by an earthquake in the 1900s, early 1900s. And there's no evidence that anybody felt guilty about guns at the turn of the 20th century because everybody used them and felt that they needed them. So that's something I think that happens a lot, is this kind of accidental revisionism where people look back at characters through history and see them from their personal perspective rather than maybe what they would have been thinking and doing during their life.
Because I think 3 floors of the house collapsed during the 1908 earthquake of San Francisco. And you tell that to people and they go, "Did it?" And it's one of those. I remember having a conversation about this with someone from the States, and they were talking about, "Oh yeah, it's a terrifyingly spooky house," and was going through all this cliched nonsense.
Yeah.
And I was just basically correcting them. And by the end of it, they weren't very happy. And I said, "Oh well, Sarah Winchester was mad." And I went, "No, she wasn't. She was a very intelligent, articulate, well-educated woman who had a love of interior design. That's what Sarah Winchester was." And I think it's one of those perceptions that it's become this, "Oh, look at Mad Sarah," where she was anything but mad. She was widowed at quite a young age, but that regardless, she was not tormented by spirits. She was quite a forward-thinking woman of her era, and at that time, I mean, we are talking of an era where women couldn't vote. So, and usually, if you weren't lucky enough to be married to a rich gentleman, most of your life would usually be spent working in servitude in some capacity, whether it was childcare or house servants. Hayley.
Yes.
So, for this lady to have pursuits outside of her expected parameter, I think also had a lot to do with this kind of negative reputation that's built up about her, because she was a very rich woman who didn't give a damn what anybody thought. She was very interested in doing things that women shouldn't be doing at that age.
Exactly, yeah.
So, yeah, and it still goes. I mean, I was listening to a podcast a year ago, and it was basically 60 minutes of the Winchester Mansion. It was basically 60 minutes of nonsense.
Yeah, I can believe that as well. I think sometimes when people hear spooky stories and these sort of, paranormal reports, it can be, I think when you've got a belief or you want to believe, it can be rewarding to read those cases and to read those stories and to not question them and not to do further research, because you think, oh, it's a historic case, people must have done their research on this. But I think, one of the kind of central questions or one of the central tenets around objective research is to question everything. And I think, that includes not only the stories that you come across and the claims that you're coming across, it's also to question yourself and what you're accepting as true and what you're accepting as evidence. And I think that's why a lot of these myths do get kind of retold and reshared, because people just don't stop to question them. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, it's one of those things. It's like Amityville, Hayley. Don't get me started on that, because it really makes me angry. I mean, here we have a situation where it was proved in a court of law it was fraud, and yet here we are 41 years later, and people still push the Amityville. Oh, it's the worst haunting of all time. No, it wasn't. Never happened. None of it's true.
It's the true story effect, isn't it?
Well, it is, because it is incredible that nobody seems to realise that there was a court case, because they fell out, the family and the author, because the family wanted more money and they thought they were being done over. So he took him to court, and it was proved that it was made up over 3 or 4 bottles of wine, because they couldn't afford the mortgage. That's what happened. And yet here we are 40 years later. I mean, I think I saw an interview with one of the children the other week, and they were still perpetuating this nonsense. Oh, like I said, don't get me started on Amityville. I get a funny feeling in my stomach, Hayley, and off I go, so I do apologise. But anyway, listen, let's talk about some strange and peculiar cases from the UK shores, and I think I'll start with one that we both had a chuckle before we started the show, which was Torquay Museum on the South Coast.
Yes.
We had a very strange story occur a couple of months ago, which hit the headlines, and as soon as I saw it, I sent it to a few friends around the world in the US and Canada and said, look, are your ghosts, because this was advertised as Britain's Sexiest Ghost, which was a headline that made me chuckle incredibly when I saw it. And when I saw the picture, I just thought, that's a woman looking at her phone.
Yeah, exactly. So I think it was I think it happened in 2016 actually, the original claim. And I remember at the time I was contacted by an American skeptical paranormal researcher who obviously couldn't visit Torquay but had seen these claims in the newspapers.
Yes.
I think maybe even as far back as 2015, but certainly this was in, I think, 2016, and he contacted me and said, do you know anything about this? Because obviously a very good way to get information about these cases is through the grapevine, through other researchers who may be familiar with cases and may have information they can share. But I didn't know anything other than the headline claims, but I had a weekend coming up that was completely free. I live in Wiltshire, so I'm not that far away from Torquay, so I was like, look, you know, you're wanting to research this, you can't go down there. I think he was researching for an article to go into Skeptical Inquirer. He couldn't get there, but I could, so I offered to go down. I spent the weekend in Torquay and I visited the museum, and so the claim was that there was a ghost hunt happening in the museum, and people saw the ghost of a woman kind of moving between exhibits, and then somebody took a photograph of this exhibit where they've got like an old farmhouse, like what it would have been like in an old farmhouse. It's like the rooms, it's just one big open plan room with like exhibits of different rooms, and they took a photograph of one of the fireplaces in one of these fake rooms, and there is a woman seated next to the fireplace. And she's sort of wearing maybe like a low cut or a V neck top. So her chest is sort of showing. And this photograph, it was claimed, shows a ghost. And she got nicknamed Britain's Sexiest Ghost because you can see like her neck. And which is kind of really desperate. Wow, you've seen a woman's neck. Well done. The year is 2016. And there were like apparently men in the comments saying, I wouldn't mind being haunted by her, and it's like, dude, it's a neck. You know, you can see more on television of live women just watching the soaps like EastEnders, you know, come on, you can even see their arms, dude.
Yeah. God knows what they'll do if they discover Hollyoaks, Hayley.
Yeah, exactly. You can see their belly buttons. But so we couldn't work out how this photograph could have been taken, like what the angles were, what the potential causes could have been. And so I went down, I spent some time in this exhibit in the museum, paid like a couple of pounds to go in or whatever. And it became apparent very quickly just from standing in front of the exhibit and the fireplace that there are these very low benches sort of next to the fireplace, and the way that it was positioned was exactly where this woman was sitting in this photograph. So to me, it became really apparent that it was literally just somebody sat next to the fireplace looking at either a digital camera, maybe which was throwing light up at her, or maybe her mobile phone or something like that. And it's such a low quality photograph as well because it's taken in the dark that it's difficult to kind of pick out details, but it's when you stand there in the room during the day with the lights on and you look, you can kind of tell straight away that it's just a person. But yeah, I did that investigation in 2016, and it's kind of just gained traction really. Just during the COVID-19 lockdown here in the UK, it actually got republished.
Yes.
And they kind of put my photograph in with it, and details of my investigation, and I was really bemused because I didn't really understand why they were writing about it, because it was such an old non-story. But I guess it was just a slow news day.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to read this little paragraph because I've actually got the article. Because, like I say, when I saw it, I didn't even need to read it. I just thought, that's clearly a woman looking at her phone.
Yeah.
But this paragraph kind of, I think, explains the battle we have sometimes, Hayley, in trying to deal with these preconceived ideas. And it simply says this. And if you see the photo, I don't know how you can come to this conclusion, but anyway. It says, a chilling photograph said by some believers to show a candlelit spirit creeping between Torquay Museum's artefacts has been labelled Britain's sexiest ghost.
By who?
Well, exactly. In the half light, it shows a pretty young woman in a low-cut blouse in the style of serving girl, and it appears beside a fire in the old Devon farmhouse exhibit from 300 years ago. The girl seems to be rising from the floor and casting her eyes down towards the light. Now,
Yeah.
she seems to be wearing a normal top.
Yes.
Her hair is not in an old-fashioned style. It's clearly a modern style of hair.
Yeah.
It looks like she's got makeup on as well.
Yeah. And the candlelight is just the fireplace, which is next to her. It's a fake fireplace that has like LED lights in it or something like that.
Yeah. And how on earth you can make the decision that she seems to be rising from the floor, I do not know, because you can't see the floor.
Well, yeah, I mean, the fireplace is sort of on floor level, so she is quite low down. But had they kind of done any investigation, they would know that there were very, very low benches there. They're the kind of benches that are sort of like, I guess, mid-shin level. They're really, really small. And I think, yeah, she was just sat on one of those.
Yeah, and I love the fact that, oh yeah, it looks like that, you know, obviously you quite clearly say, well, it's nothing special. And then somebody else goes on about, well, oh yes, it's clearly one of the most compelling paranormal photos ever taken in the history of the world. And I was just like, oh, honestly? Because, like I say, it clearly does look like a bad photo of a young lady looking at a mobile phone when she's bored on a ghost hunt.
Yeah, or maybe reviewing photographs that she's just taken.
Yeah. I mean, she's fairly solid as well. It's not a wispy image. It looks like a young lady, which, looking at that, I presume. And like I say, she doesn't seem to. Her clothes aren't old-fashioned. She seems to be wearing a fairly modern top, in my opinion. It looks like she's just got a low-cut blouse on. How did you? I mean, like I say, this whole sexy thing is very unusual as well, because that seems to be the angle that seems to have kept this story going, is the fact that people have deemed this picture to be of an attractive lady, I think.
Yes, it's odd. I've never really heard of ghosts being described as sexy. I mean, I'm sure this isn't the first time. It must have happened before. And I know that there are often tabloid stories about people who claim to be married to ghosts and have sex with ghosts and so on. But as a woman, I found it kind of funny, but also a little bit depressing that you can't even escape objectification when you're dead. They're going to come after your ghost.
Yeah, and I think we can sum up the kind of people who were excited by this, as you referred to, about all these people going, oh, isn't she gorgeous? One fan, because she's obviously got a fan club now, said, this blonde bombshell certainly sends a chill up my spine. Who knew ghosts could be so sexy? She could haunt my house and give me nightmares any day of the week.
Any day, yeah. I don't think that person's real. I feel like that's just a made-up quote.
That says Sun byline editor, if I've ever read anything in my life,
yeah,
really.
Exactly. What cheesy quote can we throw in there? Oh, she can haunt me any day of the week.
Yeah. I wouldn't want to see her busted. Oh, go away, you silly man. Right. But, I mean, that is the prime example, though. I was watching something last week where they were investigating... ironically, my cousin lives across from Mother Shipton's Cave in Knaresborough.
Right.
In North Yorkshire. I was watching a programme. That was the first episode. They went to the pub, the Mother Shipton's Inn, which is next to the cave, ironically. And my cousin literally lives about 5 minutes walk away from there. And we went in there, and it's one of those things, Hayley, when you see a programme like that, And you've been to the location and you've been there. It's very odd because basically where we were sat was apparently where this ghost hangs out. But they'd got a photo of a pair of ghostly arms reaching out. And yet it's one of those pictures where it's very easily explainable. It's somebody warming their hands on the fire and they pulled them out. And as they pulled them out, they're slightly out of focus.
Yeah, the motion blur type thing.
Yeah. So, but it was very odd because my cousin's lived in that area for a long time, knows I love the paranormal. We were talking about how the show was doing actually, because it's only about 6 months ago since we were there. So we were talking to the staff. Not one of the staff mentioned anything about this alleged ghost, even though we were talking about ghosts. Now that strikes me as peculiar.
Yeah, just a little bit.
And yet here we are. It's on Amazon Prime this year. I forgot what the show's called. And to be fair, it was slightly more balanced than some paranormal shows I've seen recently. So I'll see if I can dig it out. You might want to cast your eye on it because it might be something of interest for you, Hayley.
Yeah, definitely.
I think we can put, without wishing to stretch the pun, Hayley, I think we can put Britain's Sexiest Ghost to bed, really, can't we?
Well, if that's what you want to do.
That's what I'm saying. I was treading very carefully. Okay? I didn't mean it in that manner. That's not my...
I just feel really sorry because there is some woman out there who's alive.
Being objectified as a spirit.
And is Britain's Sexiest Ghost. Well, she doesn't even know it, probably.
Yeah, well, yes. I mean, well, it'd be interesting if she's stumbled across that picture and suddenly, whatever she does, I hope she doesn't read the comments. Poor lady. Right.
Oh.
And I think that leads into another interesting ghost, a little bit nearer to your neck of the woods, which is the ghosts of Clevendon Pier.
Yes.
Hayley. Now, I remember this story... Or certainly this story has been around for a while because there are numerous piers outside around the UK that have alleged hauntings or strange noises and things attached to them. But Clevedon seems to be one that has a very well-known alleged haunting. I think primarily because of this picture, which I think was taken about 8 years ago by a student one morning.
That's right, yes. It was 2012.
Yes. I think the chap was called Matthew Hales. And there's clearly somebody there. Now, yes. I've lived by the coast, and I know enough about piers to know usually there's a lot of people fishing early on a morning on piers.
That's right. This is one of my favourite cases that I've ever investigated.
So,
yeah.
Obviously, this picture is clearly it shows a shape of something. I mean, it does, with the greatest respect, it does look like a person. And in my personal opinion, Hayley, I think it probably is a person. However, you decided to basically have a look at this case. So tell us about it. What did you dive into, and what was your conclusions?
Was that another pun based on it being a pier? That's terrible. Diving in.
No. Unfortunately, that's how my mind works, and I make bad jokes and I don't even realise it. Really. I think I'm just terribly bad. Sorry.
Oh no, you don't have to apologise. It's funny. Yes, so Clevedon, again, is quite close to where I live, and in 2012, around that time, I had sort of been doing a lot of reflecting on how I did my research. So by that time, I was already a non-believer, so I'd kind of lost my belief in the paranormal and in ghosts in particular, and so on, and was an avid member of the UK skeptic movement and attended conferences. I still do, but I spoke a lot for Skeptic in the pub groups. I still do that now because I think that they are really good fun. You don't just get skeptics there, which is really nice.
Yes.
And it's a really good way of exploring the country too. I had been a large part of the skeptic movement in the UK, and then in 2012 the organisers of a skeptic conference called QEDCon, which is the one that happens in Manchester,
yes.
I was attending. I was also on a panel at the conference, and their sort of key speaker that year was Joe Nickell, who many people may know as he's an American paranormal researcher. He writes for Skeptical Inquirer. He works for Centre for Inquiry and so on. He's basically a full-time paranormal researcher, has been doing it for a very long time. And they asked if after the conference, would I be willing to take him up to Loch Ness? Because at that point, this is a weird tangent to go off on, and we will come back to Cleveland Pier. We will. I haven't forgotten. But at that time, the Nessie lake monster was sort of making headlines and making a splash in the news and in the Lake District. So they knew that I was investigating Nessie because I love a good lake monster, cannot resist. And they were like, would you be willing to take Joe up to Loch Ness, take him around all the hot spots? Because he's from the States. He is interested in the Loch Ness monster. This is the first chance he's ever going to have to go and visit Loch Ness. And we think that you'd be a really good guy. And I was like, yeah, I would absolutely love to do that. It would be an honour. And so I spent about a week travelling. From Manchester through the Lake District up to Scotland, and we stayed in the Lake District for a day or two, and then we went on to Scotland for a little bit to sort of do, all the sites around Loch Ness and from the Docket and so on. And beautiful. It was great, and I got to spend a lot of time with Joe Nickell, and I know that some people think that he's like this arch skeptic who's just out to debunk, but spending that much time with him, I kind of learned a lot from him about how to investigate and how to not always assume the worst of people. How, he's a very charming, lovely person, and he can get to the bottom of a case just by talking to people amicably. And obviously over the years he's kind of honed his skill for being able to see the information among the noise and so on. But we were speaking to one eyewitness who I was extremely skeptical of, but actually my skepticism was ill-placed, was really ill-placed, and it was really striking, and I learned a lot that week investigating Nessie and Nessie with Joe Nickell. And so the Cleveland Pier story sort of made the headlines just around the time that I got home after my trip with Joe. I'd already been sort of reflecting on what I did and why. So why am I investigating in this way? What am I trying to gain? And why is it such a battle? Why am I always trying to prove somebody wrong? Why am I not just trying to find out what's going on? Why am I pursuing the truth rather than pursuing a fight, maybe? So the Ghost of Cleveland Pier started making the headlines, and this photograph appeared which showed this figure standing at the end of the pier looking back at the shore. And so the guy who took the photograph is a student, or was a student at the time, who was doing a sort of photography task for his college or university, and he was taking photographs, I think it was every 10 seconds, so it was his camera was timed to take continual photographs, and the idea I think was that he was going to do a montage of the sun rising over the pier and over the sea. And in the shot before, there's no person. Then 10 seconds later, there's a figure standing at the end of the pier looking back at him. And then 10 seconds after that, there's nobody. And he didn't notice it at the time because obviously the camera's just clicking away and he's just hanging around, waiting for the sun to rise. Only when he goes back through the photographs afterwards does he notice this figure just appear out of nowhere and then disappear. I've got a feeling he then contacted the pier and was like, look, I've got this really weird photograph. The pier was closed. Could there have been anybody out there at I don't know, 5 in the morning? I don't know when the sun would have.
Yeah, it's early, it's very early. I'm sure it's sort of pre-dawn, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. And they tell him no. And they go on record in the local press that there couldn't have been anybody out on the pier because it's locked and there's a gate and you have to be able to get through the gate to get onto the pier. And they're right, it is locked at night. Once the pier closes to the public, it's locked. And then all these stories start coming out how people who volunteer in the gift shop sometimes smell burning, and people see things out the corner of their eye. So at the end of the pier there are these sheltered seats, like benches with a roof over them. Some people see a figure in that area, which happens to be where this figure is standing in the photograph. And so I reached out to the pier, the management, and I was like, hi, I'm a local researcher. I'm really not that far away from you guys. I'm really interested in what's going on and maybe trying to help you establish what's actually happening. And every time I reached out, they just didn't want to know. They were like, not calling me back. They weren't responding properly to my emails, and it sort of raised a little red flag for me, like an alarm bell went off, and I was like, well, I'm trying to be a good investigator who doesn't jump to conclusions and think the worst of people. What I should do is I should go down to the pier and I should just go and visit it as a member of the public. I don't have to go because I'm going there for a ghost investigation. I can just go there, pay my 50p or whatever and go in. That's all I need to do. So I did that. I went down. I got the train and then a bus, went down to the pier, paid my money to get in, walked down the pier, went into the tea rooms at the end, and whilst I'm in there, I'm just chatting to this young girl that volunteers and runs the tea room, and I said to her, so I saw the story in the news about the ghost. Is it really haunted here? Like, because the tea room is right where the ghost was photographed. It's like underneath the tea room. And she kind of gave me a look and just told me, she said, if I was you, I would go and speak to the fisherman. And I was like, okay, I'm definitely going to do that. And at this stage, I'm like in my kind of mid-20s, early 20s actually. And the prospect of going up to some grown men who are fishing and going, hi,
Hello.
I'm here to talk about the ghost was a little bit intimidating.
Yes.
But I plucked up the courage and I did. I approached this guy and I was like, hi there. The lady in the tea room said that I should come and speak to you guys about the ghost photo. And he was like, oh yeah, would you like to meet the ghost? And I was like, well, I did not picture that coming. Like, what? That was like the least anticipated response. And I was like, yes, I'd love to meet the ghost. And he led me down the pier. And as we're walking down, he shouts out, I think it was Ken, this young lady would like to meet the ghost of Clevendon Pier. And this guy stuck his hand out. He's like, hi, I'm the ghost of Clevendon Pier. And basically what happened is that the Sea Angling Club of Clevendon Pier, they have 24/7 access to the pier.
Yeah.
And a lot of them go fishing when the tide's in and just before the sun rises. And so this guy had recently got a new car, which was parked up on the shore and happened to just sort of be parked where this student was taking photographs from. And he was out the back of the tea rooms where you can't see that area from the shore. Is blocked literally by the building at the end of the pier. And as he's fishing, he's got his rods out and everything, and he's like, oh, I better just go check on my car. So he just popped round the end of the building, looked up at the shore, saw that it was still there, no one was acting suspiciously, and went back round to his rods. And in the meantime, the poor student up there has taken one photograph just before he pops round the building, and then as he's checking on his car, the camera clicks another photograph, and there's the figure. And then 10 seconds later, another photograph is taken, and by this time he's back round checking his fishing rods. None the wiser that he's been photographed. When you look at, and I'm stood there on the pier looking at him, and he's wearing a flotation jacket, and it's bright red with black, like across the shoulders, and they've all got them on. And the idea is that if they get knocked or blown into the sea, the jackets help them not go under and help them get back to shore. And they're all wearing them, and they're all very similar colours. And when you look at the photograph very closely, you can see that the ghost is in fact wearing a red and black flotation jacket. There we go. Absolutely. I met the ghost of Clevendon Pier and I shook his hand.
I mean, it is one of those things, Hayley. When I saw that story, and then I've revisited it when you mentioned you wanted to touch on it because of your investigation into it. The first thing I thought when I saw the picture and I knew what time it was taken, the very first thing I thought about was, well, that's somebody fishing off the pier.
Yes.
So, and yet...
Not everybody thought that, though.
But that doesn't mean I don't believe in the possibility of the paranormal, Hayley. I'm completely in agreement with what you're doing because and how you're approaching this, because I find the perpetuation of nonsense so frustrating in regards to this, because this is just a prime example of that. I mean, the Torquay Museum picture is another one where it seems that people are very happy to ignore the truth for whatever reason, be it it encourages visitors, or it builds up a reputation, or it just gets them press for basically it's free advertising. So I find it equally frustrating. I mean, it's a lovely, amusing story because, like I say, it's when you get the chance to shake hands with a real ghost, it's always a rare thing, Hayley. But
it is indeed, yes.
I mean, but one of those, like I say, I think when you have a case like that, you've got to look at all the possible explanations. And for me, ignoring everything else and leaping, I mean, this is what tends to annoy me about certain aspects of the paranormal, is there are a lot of people who will just leapfrog to a particular explanation and not go A, B, C, D, E and check it all off. Because the very first thing I would have done is gone, right, who's allowed on there?
Yeah.
What time are they there? And, like I say, I'm no expert about the coast and fishing. I know enough about the coast and the sea to know people will be out fishing at all hours of the day and night, wherever they are. Where there's a bit of coast and there's some good fishing to be had, Hayley, people will go there regardless.
Exactly. Yes. I actually use this case when I'm doing talks about ghost research. I use it to demonstrate sort of something which I call the 360-degree principle. I made that name up. It's not an actual thing, but it's about how when somebody has an experience that they think is paranormal, they have limited input. So they're only seeing or hearing or feeling or smelling, what they're experiencing. They don't have the bigger picture. So they don't have the 360-degree view of what's happening around them. They don't have a bird's eye view of what's going on. And I think paranormal researchers, whether that's psychic phenomena or ghost phenomena, monster phenomena, whatever, I think first and foremost, the most important thing to do is to try and establish that bigger picture. Rather than just going in and putting yourself in the same position that the eyewitness was in, because something is causing the phenomena that they've witnessed. And if you just stand in the same place that that eyewitness was and you try and have the same experience, then you probably are going to have it, but you haven't actually established anything other than a strange thing was experienced. But if you try and build up a bigger picture by asking questions, who, what, where, when and why, what was happening, who was there, why, when did the experience happen, what else was happening at the time that the experience happened, is all the information accurate, what was the weather like on that day, that kind of thing. You start to build up a bigger picture and you find sort of missing pieces of the puzzle, and then you do get the bigger picture, overall picture of what was going on. And actually that, to me, is, I think, when it comes to researching ghosts and researching monsters, it shouldn't matter whether you believe or don't believe in the phenomena that you're investigating. What should matter is establishing the truth, because I think something that unites everybody who's interested and who researches paranormal phenomena is that we're all interested in reality and what reality actually is. We can only establish that when it comes to these cases by asking objective questions and taking an objective stance. And so it's all, it all boils down to the approach that people take, which I mentioned before in the show. Rather than going in to try and prove that something is paranormal in nature, we should be trying to establish an objective understanding of the situation. And unfortunately, I think, especially with ghost research, a lot of people kind of stop themselves from being able to do that because they use, a lot of ghost hunting technology and sort of spiritualist methods and so on, because that's what they've seen other people doing and they're popular techniques. And actually they make your investigation less objective, because if you're using equipment that is seeking out ghosts, then you've already concluded that there's a ghost there to seek. So when people talk about, believers versus skeptics or non-believers versus believers and so on, I think actually at the core of everything that we're all doing, we're all trying to establish the truth. And we're all kind of, I think, you take a ghost hunter, like your bog standard ghost hunter, and then you take a skeptical investigator, someone who uses scientific skepticism and a rational approach, and actually they're 99% the same. There's just very few things which separate them and divide them. And I think if people were maybe more willing to consider investigations which were not belief-led, then we will probably solve a lot more mysteries. And solving mysteries, I think some people are kind of against that whole idea because mysteries are fun and they're important to life, but also solving a mystery doesn't take away mysteries. There will always be mysteries to be solved. I think it's more fun to kind of establish what's really going on than to perpetuate myths.
Absolutely. And like I say, Hayley, I find it quite odd because there are numerous people on certain pages on Facebook that if you ask them, they would probably say that I was a skeptic, but I'm not. I'm just one of those people who absolutely hates myths being perpetuated as fact. As we've touched on about Sarah Winchester and Amityville, and I'll leave it there. But, another prime example is one that occasionally pops up, which is a story about the SS Garang, if you've ever come across that one, Hayley.
I haven't, no.
Now, the SS Garang is allegedly a ship that was found adrift in the Pacific, and all the crew were found horrifically disfigured and it was covered in a weird dust, and this ship had been drifting for years. No record of this ship. No
Right.
port record of this ship. It is mentioned by an attaché in the Pacific in a letter talking about this case. That's the first ever recorded mention of this story, and it's one of those now that's got a mythos about it that has become the most haunted ship in history. So it's it's up there with the Flying Dutchman and the Mary Celeste.
Right. Okay.
But it's nonsense. None of it's true. Didn't exist. There's no record of it anywhere. There's no port log. There's no ship log. There's no route log. Nothing. And yet here we are today. I'll try and dig out something for you, and I'll send you it later, and you have a look at it.
Okay.
It'll tick all the boxes for you, because it is a prime example of one of those stories that has gained traction due to the internet, I think.
Yeah. I think also, though, what you mentioned about, not being a skeptic and myths and so on, I think for me, my kind of personal journey with paranormal research, as I mentioned, it changed a lot in 2012 after spending some time with Joe Nichol in Scotland in the Lake District. And I realised that, kind of recently I have written about not identifying with the skeptic movement in the UK and, the wider skeptical movement, especially in the States, where I think it's quite toxic.
Yes.
The skeptic movement, I think, is something very different than skepticism.
Yes.
And so when applied properly, skepticism is kind of looking at information to see if there is evidence, and if there is evidence, is that evidence good? And it sort of ties in with the scientific method, where a hypothesis should always be tested, and then the conclusion should be tested as well. Does it stand up to scrutiny?
Yes.
And when used properly, I think they're good tools for investigators. So it's okay to be skeptical. It's just, when it then crosses the line into thinking that you're superior because you don't believe in something.
Yes.
And when you then start to do a priori dismissals, which is saying, psychics aren't real, therefore parapsychology is bullshit, and that kind of thing. That those sorts of dismissals are not useful to anybody. What do they achieve?
Exactly.
So I think it's possible for a good investigator to use skepticism as a tool. I just personally don't identify with the skeptic movement anymore. But also I think it's important for investigators to not get caught up in this kind of battle to try and win arguments. I think it's important to recognise that myths and legends and stories about ghosts and paranormal claims are always going to be around. People are always going to believe that places are haunted when they're not. People are always going to believe in these legends, and it is frustrating when you know the rational cause behind them, and you know that actually it's not real. What you believe and what you've been told isn't real, and I know the facts. But I think it's important that I think it can wear you down, actually, trying to constantly try and convince people of these facts and the objective nature of these phenomena. But it can also have an adverse effect, I think. So I don't believe in ghosts. I'm fascinated by them and why people experience them and what's going on with those experiences. And I've got no interest in telling people, oh, it can't be a ghost because ghosts don't exist. And actually, I think that when it comes to hauntings, sometimes it can have an adverse effect to tell people that ghosts aren't real. It doesn't really help anybody. And if somebody believes that their house is haunted, well, it's really no skin off of my nose, as long as they're not vulnerable and they're not in harm's way and no one's ripping them off. If they believe in ghosts and that makes them happy, then fair enough. But it's also with like the Winchester Mystery Mansion and the Ghost of Clevendon Pier. If people want to believe those stories are true, it's a shame that nonsense does get perpetuated and myths do continue to be believed and to be promoted. But ultimately, there are some people that you just will never convince, and actually, trying to win them over, it's just a waste of time for you and for them, and it creates nothing but animosity.
Yeah.
So I think it's good to be rational, and I think it's good to use skepticism, and it's good to counter claims that people are making, but it's also good to know when to retreat and just to walk away from discourse.
Yeah, very true. I think it is interesting because I think both sides can end up, as you touched on there, Hayley. I found in my personal experience, neither side tends to think I'm one of them.
Yeah.
And I view both ends of each spectrum exactly the same. I think both are very toxic and self-defeating because I think they have already preconceived biases, whether it's a believer or a skeptic. It goes beyond the rationale of looking for evidence and truth. It becomes, I'm going to prove this wrong or I'm going to prove this right. And both, in my opinion, are counterproductive and purely negative for either aspect because, as you say, people will go in there with a set idea of proving it wrong regardless, and other people will go into there proving it right regardless. And there's no balance from either side in certain aspects, I think, Hayley. And that, for me, is I view both as dangerous as each other, as you say, because I think they both perpetuate their own belief system, even though they probably view each other as the complete opposite. They are acting in exactly the same manner.
Yeah, there's certain dogmatic elements to what they're doing. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. So before I let you go, I think we'll look at one more case, if that's all right with yourself, of course.
Sure, yeah.
Which is one of my favourites, and this one is in Scotland, in a graveyard that's probably more famous for another legend, though not connected with this particular one, which is Greyfriars Kirkyard in Edinburgh, which is obviously attached to the legend of Greyfriars Bobby. Regardless, we'll leave that one alone because I could probably do a whole show on whether that's real or not. But in this particular graveyard, there is a mausoleum which is attached to a very nasty gentleman from the past who was known as Bloody Mackenzie because of his wrath on the local population of Covenanters, and basically tortured and mutilated and murdered hundreds of them, unfortunately. Now, this is the Mackenzie Poltergeist, which is alleged to be one of Britain's, if not Britain's, nastiest hauntings. Now, the first time I came across this, Hayley, was when there was a alleged connection between the rather sad death of the Reverend Colin Grant and the fact that a few weeks earlier he had attempted to conduct an exorcism in the area to try and settle whatever this alleged haunting was.
Yes.
And he died. And I've seen it's one of those things where people are very, very quick to tell you how he was feeling, even though nobody seems to have mentioned it at the time. It's one of those revisionists. Oh, he was terrified and he knew he was going to die. Did he? Really?
Yeah.
Are we sure about this? Because I'm sure he'd have made a lot more fuss about it if that was the case.
Yes.
But
yes.
It's very odd because this has become one of the most notorious hauntings in the UK, primarily because there's a lot of alleged physical assaults go on here on ghost hunts and ghost walks, Hayley. So
Yes,
what was your introduction to the rather venomous reputation of the Mackenzie Polt?
Well, I remember reading about the Mackenzie Poltergeist when I was a teenager, and I think instantly it became my favourite, I say air quotes, true ghost story. And for years and years, up until very recently actually, if anybody had asked me what my favourite ghost was, I would have said the Mackenzie Poltergeist. And I've been to Edinburgh a number of times. I've got friends up there, and I've got links with the Edinburgh Skeptic Society, who are actually a very good group of people. I have a lot of time for the Edinburgh Skeptics. I've been up there a number of times to speak for them, but also just to visit Edinburgh and the friends that live there. Every chance I've had, I go to Greyfriars Kirkyard, and it's a very lovely place. It has a bit of a dodgy reputation actually, because people do get attacked there, but not by supernatural forces, by the living. And there have been a number of sexual assaults of women there at night. Don't go there on your own at night is my advice. Be cautious. It's very near bustling streets, and when you're in the kirkyard you look up and you can see the castle, and it's lovely. It's a really lovely place, and if you do get a chance, I think people should visit it. It's great to visit. It's a lovely place, absolutely beautiful during the day. And so yes, I've always been familiar with the Mackenzie Poltergeist and have visited the tomb a number of times and the whole place a number of times, and I've always sort of wanted to get punched by the Mackenzie Poltergeist. So I figured, if I'm wrong and ghosts are real, then being punched by one would be a really good way to be proven wrong.
Correct.
And, I'm willing to be punched by a ghost. I'm always happy for that to happen. Not by humans who are alive, but the dead. The dead can punch me if they want to. I'm fine with that.
Brilliant.
And because I just think it's a really cool story as well. I got punched by a ghost. You know.
Very true.
Yeah. And I've always, obviously the sort of established origin story of the Mackenzie Poltergeist is that a homeless man broke into the tomb of Mackenzie one night trying to find shelter from, I guess it was raining or stormy or something, and he broke into the tomb to try and find some shelter, and the floor caved in, or he went down some steps. I don't think there are any steps, but he went underground into the actual tomb and disturbed the grave or the remains of Mackenzie. And so that's when the haunting began. So this is the thing. So I started to dig into the story because I was like, well, if you think about it, if somebody broke into a tomb and the floor fell through, there's going to be a record of that.
Yep. And
I sort of heard several versions of the story, and it really piqued my curiosity, and so I started digging into it. There was an episode of the Monster Talk podcast where they were interviewing one of the tour guides who does the kind of ghost tour that includes the Mackenzie Poltergeist. So it goes kind of around the Mile in Edinburgh, and then the Royal Mile, and then into the Greyfriars Kirkyard at the end. And I've been on that tour, I think it was last year, but they were interviewing one of the tour guides, a guy called Fred Fogarty, I think his name was. He was telling his version of the story, and he basically said that a groundskeeper had been disturbed by some noise, like loud crashing noises in the tomb or from near the tomb of George Mackenzie. And when he investigated, he discovered that this guy had broken into there and was, trying to get out. And then after that, the poltergeist activity started. And there's a guy called Jan Andrew Henderson who wrote a book. And in his book, he claims that this poltergeist first made its presence known in 1999. And a woman was looking through the door and was knocked over by like this blast of air that came out and in her face. And ever since then, people have claimed to be attacked by the poltergeist. And it's called like the UK's most active poltergeist. Now, any paranormal investigator in their right is going to want to know what's going on.
Yes.
But no one does paranormal investigations into the Mackenzie Poltergeist, which seemed really odd to me because if this poltergeist is as active as is claimed, then this is a really, really good way of proving that ghosts exist or that something paranormal in nature exists. Why is nobody investigating it? Well, the reason no one's investigating it is because the tour company, which is, I think, owned by Jan Andrew Henderson, they are the only people who are allowed access into the Covenanters prison. So it kind of joins on to Greyfriars Kirkyard. I don't think it's actually part of the kirkyard, but it's like an adjacent part. And there are these big metal gates that get locked, and you can't get in there unless the guides let you in on the ghost tour. And I think they're the only people who can get access to that area. So it would be really difficult for paranormal researchers to do that. So the only way that we can kind of establish what's going on is to actually research the facts of the origin of this story. And the question is it true, and do these people really get attacked by a poltergeist? And so I started to do some digging into the origin story, and almost immediately several different origins for this poltergeist start popping up. So Andrew Henderson claims that it started in 1991 after the break-in. Then I also found newspaper articles which claimed that, so this was in 1999, that in a newspaper article in the Daily Record said that almost 100 incidents in the last 50 years point to Mackenzie's presence. So either it started in 1999 or in 1999 it's already been haunting for 50 years. So almost immediately we have a discrepancy. And so I started digging more because that to me was really tempting. I needed to know more. Now there was a woman who lives up in Edinburgh who helped me, Sandra, who kind of helped by going to the library and looking for physical records of the break-in of the tomb, and nothing was on record. There is no record of somebody breaking into the tomb, which is really bizarre because there should be a record. And not only that, but in 2003, 5 years later after the 1998 alleged incident, in 2003, 2 teenagers did break into the tomb, and they desecrated the corpse of Mackenzie. They cut his head off, which is absolutely horrendous. I sat in my local library reading about this, or just like absolutely gobsmacked. They cut his head off, took the head out of the tomb, and then started kicking it and throwing it around like one with a football.
Yes.
So they were playing with it, and they were the first people to be put on trial for violation of basically this old grave robbing law.
Yes.
They were the first people to be put on trial for it in over 100 years. So I find it highly questionable that somebody would break into the tomb in 1998 seeking shelter, and for this not to happen to them, but for it to happen just 5 years later to these 2 teenage boys. Also, when you stand in front of the tomb, this guy broke into, there is an opening at the back with a grill over it, but it's far too small for a person to fit into. And when I was on the ghost tour last year, the kind of the narrative that they've built around it is just highly, highly questionable. The idea that this man was so emaciated that he could fit through this small gap was just too incredible. I couldn't even fit my leg through there. I'm not the thinnest of people, but I'm not huge either, and my leg wouldn't go through that gap, let alone a fully grown man. But what struck me the most, not necessarily the whole gotcha thing, because it's clear that this story has been exaggerated a lot and played upon for these ghost tours. What was most interesting to me was how the story around Mackenzie had changed because of these ghost stories. So historically, the things he did were horrible, and he was a horrible person, unfortunately. I hate to call people horrible, but he was a horrible person.
Absolutely.
And, if anything, his should be a restless ghost because of the ill deeds that he did in his life. If we're looking at ghost traditions, the reason that he should be shouting and banging and throwing people around is because he's buried right there where he killed people. The people that he was responsible for died in horrendous conditions. That should be what keeps him restless, not because a homeless man broke into his tomb, which we cannot establish is actually happening. What the tour guides have actually done, what their stories have actually done, is turned this kind of vindictive ghost who is not at rest because of his crimes in life. They've turned him into a victim, and the reason that he's lashing out at people is because he's been disturbed. And so poor Mackenzie, he's lashing out at people because he's been disturbed. He's the most violent poltergeist in the country. So we've sort of seen the revision of history, and although his victims do get spoken about, it's what's been done to him which is the focus of all the coverage of that story.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting, Hayley, because I've heard both versions of that story. Well, or several, because there's an amalgamation of a few there.
Yes.
But I remember when this first came to prominence, when this alleged incident happened where this homeless person had broken in for shelter. But I'd also heard the version that the reason he was so disturbed and violent was because of where he was buried. So straight away you've got 2 different origin stories. And it's like, well, it's the chicken and the egg. So which came first?
Exactly.
And like you say, when you look into this story, for me, the more shocking aspect of it is that incident with the 2 lads. I mean, who on earth thought kicking a disembodied head around was a good idea for fun?
I think it probably, I suppose it, they were young, peer pressure, showing off. I think there were girls there, but it's quite extreme. It's an extreme way. Like, my friends never did that. We never desecrated any graves,
No. I used to do my Ouija board in a graveyard, Hayley, and we never, we used to go around and get people's names.
You did it without a spade.
We didn't dig anybody up. We just went round and found out who was buried there, and then we'd try and contact them. We certainly didn't do any desecration. And the people, to be honest, Hayley, the people I knocked about with it as a younger person would probably be the kind of people you would expect to be caught in a desecration scandal. to be honest. But anyway, my life story is not
circumstances. But I think they didn't actually get charged in the end, and I hope that they've then gone on to learn their lessons. And there was actually a show in the UK called Grime Fighters or something like that, and one of the episodes of that show actually covered or followed his remains being put back into his tomb after the desecration had happened. But I actually searched really hard to try and find an archived version of that show. It just can't be found. I thought it would be really interesting to watch that happening and see how they spoke about what had happened. And, you know, him being returned and reinterred to his tomb, but no, that, you know, there is nothing, unfortunately, available online.
I mean, it is a very strange place, because Edinburgh has a very well known reputation as being one of the most haunted cities in, you know, several places.
Yeah.
Will claim, you know, I'm sure Edinburgh and York often argue between themselves about what's the most haunted city in England. In Britain even. They're not going to argue about who's the most haunted in England, clearly. So it's that tradition again. Obviously, you know, I've spent a lot of time in York over the years, Hayley. I've had friends who live there, and it's obviously living in Yorkshire. It's one of those places. It's a beautiful place, and it's one of those cities that it seems near enough every other pub has a ghost story, and there are numerous investigations you can find on the internet and such like. But once again, that is a lot to do. There's a lot going on there at play, and it's not just centurions and strange things like that. There are different hauntings in different areas, and Edinburgh seems to be one of those places where the ghost, I think it's called Deadly Walks or some other charming name. Not that I'm accusing them of anything, but it often with situations like this, there is a tendency to exaggerate for entertainment's sake.
Yes, and sometimes the line between entertainment and reality does become blurred, and I think that's why it's important that people learn or remember to question everything. I think also that the ghost walk in Edinburgh that went into Greyfriars was not the most enjoyable ghost walk I've ever done. I'm not going to give any spoilers, but there is a reason they say not to do the walk if you've got heart problems, and it's not to do with ghosts. You're not going to have a heart attack because of ghosts. But I won't spoil it because I would hate to do that, but yes. It's certainly not the most enjoyable. It was historically, it was interesting. Don't get me wrong. As a ghost walk, not the most enjoyable. There are many others that are much more charming.
Yes.
And I think that's the thing when it comes to ghost stories and when it comes to ghost tours and walks and buildings that say, you know, we're the most haunted. Look at this history. And I think ghosts through the years have always been a useful way to remember what came before. And to celebrate our ancestry and our history. And in America, for example, you see people claiming to be haunted by the indigenous people, so, you know, ancient burial grounds and so on. It's also a way of celebrating history and the people who were part of our history, but it's also, I think that ghosts are a useful way for people to sort of repent for their past and to learn lessons. So bad things were done to these people, therefore they're here to scare us and to haunt us because we deserve to be haunted. And I think there's that sort of narrative that can be taken from ghosts and hauntings too. So I think, although I don't believe in ghosts, I think they do serve a very useful function in society.
I mean, it is something, because like I said, I love that aspect as well, because I'm always thirsty for knowledge in a variety of subjects, Hayley, and got an appreciation of history and the paranormal and things like that. So I find that equally as interesting when I'm, you know, on ghost tours in certain, you know, if I'm in an area for a certain amount of time, I will attempt to get myself on the local ghost tour. And like I say, I've had friends live in York. I had family who lived in Chester, which is another contender for a very haunted place. Liverpool is another one as well. And here in my home city, Sheffield, strangely, is not one of those places that talks about its ghostly history, but there is a very well established ghost tour here, which I've been on a couple of times, and it's jolly good fun. Some of the stories
they can be fun. I love a good ghost walk.
Yeah, I mean, some of the stories are a bit gruesome because obviously Sheffield was horrifically bombed during the Second World War, and there is a couple of terrible stories about incidents involving members of the public being caught in air raids, which are fact. There is no getting out of it, and it's a tragic story in its own, Hayley. So I think it gives you an appreciation of the locality wrapped up with an entertainingly spooky twist.
Yes, exactly. I totally agree.
Well, Hayley, I'd just like to say thank you so much for your time today.
Oh, you're welcome.
It's been lovely to discuss a few cases with you and get to know you a bit better, so thank you for your time. Where can everybody keep up to date with your fabulous blog and what you're up to?
Well, you can find the blog at hayleysaghost.co.uk. That's Hayley is a ghost. And I'm at Hayley Stevens on Twitter. I'm always tweeting. It's a really bad habit. I've also got a podcast which is called The Spooktator, and you can find that at spooktator.co.uk. So that's the word spook and then tator.co.uk. We're on a bit of a break at the moment because of the kind of pandemic and everything that's going on, but we do try and put out episodes where we can, but it's not like a regular thing. But yeah, that's probably the best places to look if you want to catch up.
Fabulous. And I'll put links to everything in the show notes so everybody can find them nice and easily as well, though I suspect that they're pretty easy to track down. But I always do that anyway, regardless, Hayley. Before I let you go, once this is all lifted, if you had the opportunity to go somewhere that you've not had a chance to go to next to dig into a particular case, Hayley, what would be the one that you would be dashing out the door post-lockdown to visit if you could in the UK?
Well, in the UK.
Yeah, I'll keep you because quarantine might stop us leaving.
True. Because I've got plans. I'm hoping eventually to be able to go and visit the Queen Mary, the ship.
Fabulous.
It's sort of a dream of mine, and I'm like, what's stopping me?
Yes.
In the UK, I think. Oh my gosh. Do you know? I've never been to Bodmin Jail, and I've never been to York. I went as a child, but I've never been as an adult. And obviously there's that episode of Most Haunted from the Golden Fleece.
Yes,
and
nice pint in there.
Yes, and I have friends who live up in York in that area, and I've always promised to do a talk for there's a skeptics group out there, I think, but I've just never really been able to schedule it in. And I guess maybe York or somewhere like the Hellfire Cave, somewhere else I've never been. That I haven't actually visited. When it comes to places which are famously haunted in this country and have been almost haunted, I've only really visited a handful of them. Probably really need to do more ghost tourism, really.
Yeah, well, I think we all should, to be honest, Hayley.
Yes.
So, excellent. Food for thought. Thank you very much. Well, listen, once again, it's been an absolute pleasure to finally speak to you. I'm delighted to have you as a guest finally, and I look forward to your continued excellent work, and we will keep an eye on your work going forwards.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for having me. It's been great.
My pleasure. Take care.
And you.